All right, ready to dive into a big one.
Uh,
This time we're tackling press regulation, and specifically the UK's Leveson inquiry.
Yeah, this isn't just some obscure bit of legal history.
Right, this gets to the heart of how a free press should operate in a democracy. And our listener sent in a ton of material on this, so.
It's clearly an issue people care about, and for good reason.
Exactly. So, no time to waste. Let's start with the basics. What exactly was the Leveson inquiry, and why was it such a big deal?
Well, imagine this. It's 2011, and the UK is rocked by the phone hacking scandal. Turns out, journalists, especially at the now-defunct News of the World,
Which was a huge tabloid at the time, right?
massive. They were caught hacking into people's private voicemails. And not just celebrities, either.
We're talking victims of crime, even. Wasn't Millie Dowler, a murdered schoolgirl, a victim?
Exactly her. It was a massive breach of privacy, and it sparked outrage. It made people question the ethics of the entire press.
Yeah, if journalists are willing to stoop that low, what else are they capable of? It really shook public trust.
Absolutely. And it went beyond just one rogue reporter or even one bad newspaper. It exposed systemic issues within the press.
Right, like this wasn't just a one-off, it pointed to something bigger. So the Leveson inquiry was set up to investigate all of this, right?
Exactly. They were tasked with figuring out what went wrong, how it happened, and what could be done to prevent it from happening again.
So it wasn't just about punishing the bad actors, it was about examining the whole system, right?
Exactly. And one of the key things they looked at was the effectiveness of the existing self-regulation system.
Which at the time was the Press Complaints Commission, the PCC.
Right. And the PCC, well, let's just say they weren't exactly known for their toughness.
More like a watchdog without any teeth, right?
Righty much. I mean, there was one case from the sources where a major newspaper published all these unsubstantiated claims about a celebrity's personal life. The public was outraged, but what did the PCC do?
Let me guess. They sent them a strongly worded letter.
Basically, they issued a mild reprimand that did little to address the core issue of irresponsible reporting. And that wasn't an isolated incident. The PCC had a long history of being, well, ineffective.
So one of the big questions the inquiry had to grapple with was, if self-regulation is failing, what's the alternative?
Right, and that's where things get really interesting. Because you have to balance the need to hold the press accountable with the importance of protecting a free and independent press.
And those two things, they can sometimes feel like they're at odds with each other, right?
Exactly. And that tension was at the heart of the Leveson inquiry. One of the terms that came up a lot was chilling effect.
Chilling effect. What does that mean in this context?
It means that if the penalties for publishing something inaccurate or intrusive are too harsh, it could scare even responsible journalists away from pursuing important stories.
So it's like you don't want to create a climate of fear where journalists are too afraid to do their jobs properly.
Exactly. And the inquiry uncovered some pretty striking examples of this tension playing out in the real world.
Like what?
Well, for one, there was evidence that some newspapers had threatened to withdraw from self-regulation entirely if they faced more stringent oversight.
Wow, so they were basically saying, we'll police ourselves, but only on our terms.
It really highlighted the power dynamics at play and the resistance to change within certain corners of the press.
That's a bold move to threaten to go completely rogue if you don't get your way.
It speaks to how high the stakes were, and it's something the inquiry had to take very seriously as they considered how to move forward.
So we've got this backdrop of a major scandal, a public outcry, and a system of self-regulation that seems completely inadequate.
It was a perfect storm that forced the UK to take a long, hard look in the mirror and ask some tough questions about the role of the press in a free society.
And about how to balance freedom of the press with the need to protect individuals from harm.
Exactly.
And that's what makes the Leveson inquiry so fascinating. It wasn't just about one scandal, it was about grappling with fundamental questions about the relationship between the press and the public.
And those questions are more relevant than ever in today's world.
So last time we were talking about the PCC and how it was supposed to be this watchdog organization keeping the press in check.
Right. But in reality,
They weren't exactly striking fear into the hearts of any editors.
let's just say their bark was much worse than their bite.
So why was that? Was it just a case of being too cozy with the newspapers they were supposed to be regulating?
Well, imagine a referee who also happens to be on the payroll of one of the teams.
Okay, that's not exactly impartial.
Exactly. And that's essentially what was going on with the PCC. A good chunk of their funding came directly from the newspapers they were supposed to be holding accountable.
Talk about a conflict of interest.
Right. So not exactly a recipe for independent oversight. And unsurprisingly, this lack of independence translated into a reluctance to really crack down on powerful newspapers.
Because no one wants to upset the people paying the bills, right?
Exactly. But it wasn't just the funding that was the problem. The PCC structure also had some serious flaws.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, for one, serving editors, people actively working at newspapers, were allowed to sit on the PCC's board.
So it's like having the players themselves decide on the rules of the game.
Pretty much. And it created this perception, whether fair or not, that the PCC was more interested in protecting the industry than in holding it accountable.
It's that old saying, the fox guarding the hen house.
Exactly. And speaking of foxes and hen houses, the sources also talk about how the PCC lacked any real teeth when it came to enforcement.
What do you mean?
Well, they didn't have the power to compel witnesses to testify during investigations.
So they were basically relying on people to voluntarily come forward and incriminate themselves. Good luck with that.
Right. And they couldn't demand documents or anything like that. So they were at the mercy of the newspapers when it came to getting information.
It sounds like they were completely outmatched.
To make matters worse, even when they did find evidence of wrongdoing, the PCC's hands were tied in terms of what they could actually do about it.
Let me guess, a strongly worded letter.
You're getting good at this.
Hmm.
Yeah, their main form of punishment was issuing critical statements about a newspaper's conduct.
Which I'm sure those newspapers were just absolutely mortified about.
Right. For these huge media organizations, a critical statement from the PCC was basically seen as a minor PR annoyance, not exactly the deterrent it was supposed to be.
So it sounds like the PCC was kind of set up to fail from the start.
In a lot of ways, yes. It was this strange hybrid organization trying to serve two masters, but ultimately, it just didn't have the tools or the will to effectively regulate the press.
Okay, so the PCC was a bust. But the Leveson inquiry didn't just stop there, right? They came up with some alternative solutions. So we've spent the last two episodes talking about how the UK's system of self-regulation for the press, with the PCC and all that.
Right, how it basically wasn't working.
Yeah, to put it mildly. But the Leveson inquiry, they didn't just want to point out the problems.
Oh, no, they were tasked with finding solutions too, which, given the complexities we've discussed, wasn't easy.
Right, because you've got this fundamental tension between protecting freedom of the press.
Which is absolutely crucial in a democracy, of course.
Yeah, of course. But then also you've got to protect the public from the harms that an irresponsible press can inflict.
Which can be very real and very serious.
Yeah.
Libel, slander, invasion of privacy, the list goes on. And those harms could have a lasting impact, not just on individuals, but on society as a whole.
Right. It erodes trust in institutions, makes people cynical. So, given all of that, what did Leveson actually recommend? What were some of the options on the table?
Well, one idea was actually to ditch the whole idea of a dedicated press regulator altogether.
Really? Just scrap the whole thing and start over?
Well, not quite starting over. The idea was to let existing laws, the laws against libel and slander and so on.
Right, the stuff that's already on the books.
Exactly. To let those laws be the main way to deal with press misconduct. So if a newspaper publishes something defamatory, you sue them in court, just like you would anyone else.
So a completely hands-off approach. Let the legal system sort it out.
Exactly. The government wouldn't be involved in regulating the press directly at all.
That's one way to do it. What were the arguments for and against that approach?
Well, the main argument in favor was that it would prevent government interference in the press.
Because even if the government has good intentions, there's always that risk that they'll use their power to silence criticism, right?
Exactly. And proponents of this hands-off approach argued that self-regulation, as we've seen, is basically toothless.
You can say that again.
But they also argued that any government involvement, even if it's well-intentioned, could create a chilling effect on journalism.
Right. We talked about that earlier, how journalists might shy away from certain stories if they're too afraid of being punished.
Exactly. So their view was, let the courts handle it. It's the least intrusive way to regulate the press.
Okay, I get that. But on the flip side, isn't going to court incredibly expensive and time-consuming?
That was the main criticism, yeah. Critics argued that this approach would basically favor the press because they have deep pockets and can afford to fight legal battles for years, whereas ordinary people...
Most people don't have the time or the money to hire a team of lawyers to go up against some media giant.
Exactly. So for them, relying solely on the courts just wasn't a realistic option. They felt it would create a system where the press could act with impunity, knowing that they could outspend almost anyone who tried to challenge them in court.
It's David versus Goliath, and we all know how that story usually ends.
Right. And that's why the inquiry also explored other options, like a more robust system of self-regulation.
So, like the PCC, but with actual teeth this time.
Precisely. The idea was to create a new regulator, completely independent from both the government and the press industry. It would have its own independent funding stream, so it wouldn't be beholden to the newspapers it was overseeing.
Okay, so that takes care of the conflict of interest issue we talked about earlier.
Right. And this new regulator would have real teeth, the power to launch investigations, compel witnesses to testify, demand documents, and impose hefty fines on newspapers that broke the rules.
So, no more strongly worded letters.
Well, maybe a few of those, but they would also have some serious firepower to back them up.
Okay, that makes sense. But wouldn't setting up a whole new organization like this be really complicated and expensive?
It would definitely be a big undertaking. And there would need to be safeguards in place to ensure that this new regulator actually remained independent and didn't just become another industry puppet.
Because we've seen that movie before, haven't we?
Exactly. But the inquiry felt that the potential benefits in terms of protecting the public and upholding press standards outweighed the challenges.
So, a tough needle to thread, but potentially worth it. Did they look at any real-world examples of this kind of system working well?
They did. They looked at models in Scandinavia where they have these statutory press councils that are funded by the industry.
So, the newspapers themselves are paying for the regulation.
Exactly. But, and this is key, these councils operate completely independently of the government. They have their own staff, their own budgets, and they're free to investigate and sanction newspapers without any interference.
Hmm, that's an interesting model. And it seems to be working for them.
So far, so good. These councils have a good track record of upholding press standards and holding newspapers accountable, and they've generally been pretty well respected by both the press and the public.
That's impressive. So, was the Leveson inquiry basically suggesting that the UK should just copy and paste the Scandinavian model?
Not exactly. They recognize that what works in one country might not necessarily work in another. You have to consider the specific legal and cultural context.
Right, because every country has its own unique media landscape, its own history, its own traditions when it comes to freedom of the press.
Exactly. So while the inquiry found the Scandinavian model to be intriguing, they weren't ready to say, this is the answer, let's implement it wholesale.
Makes sense. You can't just import a system from one country and expect it to magically solve all your problems.
Precisely. But what they did do was highlight the Scandinavian model as a potential source of inspiration, as a system that seemed to be striking that balance between freedom and accountability pretty effectively.
So, a potential roadmap, but not a one-size-fits-all solution. And I think that's an important point to emphasize here. There is no perfect system, no magic bullet when it comes to press regulation.
Absolutely. It's an ongoing process of trying to find the right balance, and that balance might look different in different countries and at different times.
Well said. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the phone hacking scandal that sparked the Leveson inquiry to the potential solutions for creating a more responsible press. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
This whole issue, it's not just some abstract debate. It matters because it affects all of us. The information we consume, the way our democracies function, it all hinges on having a free and responsible press. So stay informed, keep asking those tough questions, and demand better from the journalists and the media organizations that shape our understanding of the world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. A free press is a cornerstone of a healthy democracy, but it only works if it's also a responsible press. And that's something worth striving for no matter where you are in the world. Until next time, stay curious.